On a chilly San Diego evening in 1986, a single bullet pierced the window of a mansion, silencing the life of Dan Broderick, a renowned San Diego attorney, and claiming the life of his new wife, Linda Colkina. The killer was none other than Dan's ex-wife, Betty Broderick, who would later claim self-defense in a trial that would captivate the nation. As the investigation unfolded, detectives discovered a trail of evidence pointing to a calculated and premeditated act. Betty had a history of erratic behavior and had previously threatened Dan, but investigators were surprised by the level of sophistication displayed in the crime. The bullet that killed Dan was fired from a .38 caliber handgun, which was later found in Betty's possession. Witnesses reported that on the night of the shooting, Betty was seen at a local bar, where she claimed to have been celebrating a friend's birthday. However, a bartender later testified that Betty was visibly agitated and had been drinking heavily throughout the evening. A search of Betty's home revealed a notebook containing a detailed timeline of Dan's daily routine, including the exact time he would be at home. This level of planning and attention to detail raised suspicions that the shooting was not a spontaneous act of violence, but rather a carefully orchestrated event. In the months leading up to the shooting, Betty had become increasingly unhinged, sending Dan and his new wife numerous threatening letters and making phone calls to their home. Neighbors reported hearing loud arguments between the two, which often escalated into physical altercations. As the trial progressed, Betty's defense team argued that she had been driven to madness by Dan's alleged infidelity and his decision to leave her for Linda. However, prosecutors countered that Betty's actions were those of a cold-blooded killer who had carefully planned and executed the murder of her ex-husband and his new wife. In a dramatic courtroom moment, Betty's defense team presented a series of letters written by Dan, which they claimed proved his own infidelity and abuse towards Betty. However, prosecutors pointed out that the letters were dated years before the shooting and were not relevant to the case at hand. Ultimately, the jury found Betty guilty of 2 counts of murder, and she was sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. As she was led away in handcuffs, Betty claimed that she had been driven to madness by Dan's cruelty and that she had acted in self-defense. However, the evidence presented in court told a different story, one of a calculated and premeditated act of violence, committed by a woman who had been consumed by her own rage and obsession. The investigation into the murders of Dan and Linda Broderick began on November 5, 1986, when police received a call from a neighbor reporting a shooting at the Broderick estate. Detectives from the San Diego Police Department, led by Detective Robert Williams, arrived at the scene to find 2 bodies riddled with bullets. As they began to process the crime scene, they discovered a cryptic note on the kitchen counter, purportedly written by Betty, stating, "I'm sorry, Dan." The police were left with more questions than answers as they scoured the estate for evidence. Detectives interviewed numerous witnesses, including neighbors, friends, and family members of the Brodericks, but no one seemed to have any concrete information about the motive behind the murders. The police did, however, discover a few inconsistencies in Betty's alibi, which raised suspicions about her involvement. As the investigation continued, detectives found a spent shell casing in Betty's driveway, which matched the caliber of the gun used in the murders.
But was this evidence enough to link Betty to the crime?
It wasn't until the trial that the dark secrets about Dan's past began to unravel, revealing a complex web of deceit and betrayal. Dan's lawyer, who had represented him in his divorce proceedings, testified that Dan had been emotionally abusive and controlling throughout his marriage to Betty. This revelation shook the courtroom, as it became clear that Betty's defense team was building a case around Dan's alleged mistreatment of her. The prosecution, however, was quick to point out that Betty's behavior had been erratic and violent in the months leading up to the murders. In a shocking twist, the defense team produced a hidden child, a daughter Dan had fathered with a former mistress, which they claimed had been a contributing factor to Dan's abuse of Betty. The courtroom was stunned as the defense team presented evidence of Dan's infidelity and financial deceit, which they argued had driven Betty to the brink of madness. As the trial continued, it became clear that the truth behind the murders was far more complex than initially thought, and that Betty's defense team was determined to prove that she had acted in self-defense. On June 22, 1989, the jury delivered a guilty verdict, finding Betty Broderick guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom erupted into chaos as Betty's family and friends wept in despair. The sentencing phase of the trial was a somber affair, with the judge imposing a 32-year to life prison sentence on Betty. As she was led away in handcuffs, Betty's family and friends vowed to appeal the verdict, but it was clear that the damage had been done. In the aftermath of the trial, the nation was left to ponder the complexities of domestic violence and the battered wife syndrome. Had Betty truly acted in self-defense, or was she a calculating killer who had waited for the perfect moment to strike? The case of Betty Broderick would go on to become a cautionary tale about the dangers of domestic violence and the devastating consequences of unchecked rage. Follow Texas Case Archive for more true crime.